some of you are standing in front of something that has hurt you and disappointed you, and you can't make sense of it. And the question tonight is, do not interpretations belong to God? Because in this moment of your life, the way you interpret what is standing in front of you, whether it's in the form of an opportunity or opposition, will determine the momentum that you have going forward into the rest of your life. And now Joseph is in a position of power, but what happens next in his life depends on what he does in this moment. And the Bible says in Genesis 45 verse 1, then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. And he cried, make everyone go out from me. So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud so that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Up until this point, they didn't know who he was because he looked so different than he did the last time they saw him. Sometimes what God will take you through in your life will make the people who used to know you unable to recognize you. But the test comes when you have to decide what you are going to do with the people who did not recognize what God had put in you, and in many cases resisted it. Now Joseph is in this moment, and he identifies himself. I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. So Joseph said to his brothers, come near to me, please. See, it's really hard to interpret your situation from a distance. And when you keep things at a distance and deal with things at a distance and keep it out here and refuse to call it closer, I want you to think about the magnitude of this moment. When he calls the same brothers who almost destroyed his life close to him so that he can speak to them. And the question is, how will he interpret this moment? And Joseph said to his brothers, come near to me, please. And they came near, and he said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And verse 5 is my assignment. He said, and now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. You see that? For God sent me before you to preserve life. Again. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. I noticed two things in that verse, and they contradict one another on the surface. Joseph said, you sold me. But then he says, God sent me. And when I was studying the text, I was asking the question, well, which one is it? You sold me or God sent me? And what God spoke to me about that is, the first one is the event. But the second one is the interpretation. The first one is what you did. But the second one is what I decided about what you did. It is not the event that determines the direction of your life. It is not the event that determines the outcome of this season. It is not the event that determines the trajectory of your ministry. It is your interpretation. Do not interpretations belong to God? So I'm not downplaying what you did to me. You pushed me into that pit. It's a fact. It happened. I can't take it back. I can't change it. I didn't like it. It wasn't right. You broke my heart. You left me alone. You should have been there and you weren't there. You talked about me. You left me by myself. You said you would and you didn't. You sold me, but God sent me, and all at the same time. It's not two separate realities. It is one event and two interpretations. So I came to ask you a question tonight. Do not interpretations belong to God? Do you want to live in the reality of the event or the revelation? See, I used to always expect God to respond to my prayers with an intervention. And the more I read the story of Joseph, I realized that in many different situations, God chose not to intervene for Joseph. And God chose not to change the situation at all. Silence. Silence. This should have been a breakout session, really. I'm telling you. This is the kind of message that I never wanted to hear, because I thought that God would always change the situation if I had enough faith to change it. And then a few situations came into my life that no matter how much I prayed about them, or no matter how much I fought, the situation didn't change. But the more I prayed, the more I started to change. I need an interpretation. I need an interpretation of what I'm going through in my life right now. I need God to show me why my children are acting crazy. I need God to show me. See, if you don't learn to interpret situations, that's the greatest gift that the Spirit of God gives, is the ability to interpret a situation according to your faith, not your feelings. And I am learning this more and more, that my interpretation is so off sometimes because I interpret other people's reactions through my own insecurities. And so I keep trying to judge people's responses to me, but if I'm interpreting it through my own insecurities, I look like grasshoppers in my own eyes, not in theirs. That's an interpretation. The first time I preached internationally through an interpreter, I was so nervous that I called one of the men in our church who had preached internationally more than I had, and I said, "You got any tips for me?" He was like, "Yeah, pray for a good interpreter." And I said, "Well, what makes a good interpreter?" And he said a few things, but I said, "How will I know if I've got a bad one?" He said, "Well, when you finish talking, if he talks a lot longer than you just talked, you've got a bad interpreter. If you say one sentence and he says three, then he's adding something to what you just said. You've got a bad interpreter." And I came all the way from Charlotte, North Carolina to tell you, you got a bad interpreter. Because you keep adding stuff, like you keep hearing things that aren't there, and seeing things that aren't there, and thinking things that aren't true. Some of you need to fire your interpreter, because you are interpreting your present through the lens of your past. And so you're dragging all of that pain and all of that resentment and all of that regret, and you are in the prison of your own perspective. And so what God has given you really is good, and it really is a reason to celebrate, and you really could be content. But your interpreter is telling you stuff based on what other people have. You know, it's a terrible way to interpret your life, through somebody else's Instagram post, because that is not their real life. That is not their real family. Their kids only acted like that for 3 seconds for them to take the picture, and then they started biting each other. It is not real. It is an illusion. And Paul said, pray for the power to interpret. Now, I don't just want the power to interpret tongues. I want the power to interpret my trials and my tests and my trauma. Because if I don't interpret it correctly, if God doesn't give me the power to interpret it, I'll fight all the wrong battles on all the wrong levels. And I'll send my brothers away because they hurt me when they were the very opportunity that God gave me.